The air around the second planet of the Froxar system was stale and unwholesome. The dank winds that swept continually over its surface swept over salt flats, dried up marshlands, tangled and rotting vegetation and the crumbling remains of ruined cities. No life moved across its surface. The ground, like that of many planets in this part of the galaxy, had long been deserted. The howl of the wind was desolate enough as it gusted through the old decaying houses of the cities. It was more desolate as it whipped about the bottoms of the tall black towers that swayed uneasily here and there about the surface of this world. At the top of these towers lived colonies of large, scraggy, evil-smelling birds, the sole survivors of the civilization that once lived here. The howl of the wind was at its most desolate, however, when it passed over a pimple of a place set in the middle of a wide grey plain on the outskirts of the largest of the abandoned cities. This pimple of a place was the thing that had earned this world the reputation of being the most totally evil place in the galaxy. From without, it was simple a steel dome about 30 feet across. From within, it was something more monstrous than the mind can comprehend. About 100 yards or so away, and separated from it by a pockmarked and blasted stretch of the most barren land imaginable, was what would probably have to be described as a landing pod of sorts. That is to say, that scattered over a largish area were the ungaining hulks or 2 or 3 dozen crash-landed buildings. Flitting over and around these buildings was a mind that was waiting for something. The mind directed its attention into the air, and before very long a distant speck appeared, surrounded by a ring of smaller specks. The largest speck was the left-hand tower of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy office building, descending through the stratosphere of Frogstar World B. As it descended, Husta suddenly broke the long, uncomfortable silence that had grown up between the two men. He stood up and gathered his towel into a bag. He said, "Preble box, I will now do the job I was sent here to do." Zaphod looked at him from where he was sitting in a corner sharing unspoken thoughts with Marvin. "Yeah?" he said. "The building will shortly be landing. When you leave the building, do not go out of the door," said Husta. "Go out of the window." "Good luck," he added, and walked out the door, disappearing from Zaphod's life as mysteriously as he had ended it. Zaphod leapt up and tried the door, but Husta had already locked it. He shrugged and returned to the corner. 2 minutes later, the building crash-landed amongst the other wreckage. Its escort of Frogstar fighters deactivated their force beams and soared off into the air again, bound for Frogstar World A, an altogether more congenial spot. They never landed on Frogstar World B. No one did. No one ever walked on its surface, other than the intended victims of the Total Perspective Vortex. Zaphod was badly shaken by the crash. He lay for a while in a silent dusty wobble to which most of the room had been reduced. He felt that he was at the lowest ebb he had ever reached in his life. He felt bewildered, he felt lonely, he felt unloved. Eventually, he felt he ought to get whatever it was over with. He looked around the cracked and broken room. The wall had split round the doorframe and the door hung open. The window, by some miracle, was closed and unbroken. For a while he hesitated. Then he thought that if his strange and recent companion had been through all that he had been through just to tell him what he had told him, then there must be a good reason for it. With Marvin's help he got the window open. Outside it, the cloud of dust aroused by the crash, and the hulks of the other buildings with which this one was surrounded, effectively prevented Zaphod from seeing anything of the world outside. Not that this concerned him unduly. His main concern was what he saw when he looked down. Zonywoop's office was on the 15th floor. The building had landed at a tilt of about 45 degrees, but still the descent looked heart-stopping. Eventually, stung by the continuous series of contemptuous looks that Marvin appeared to be giving him, he took a deep breath and clambered out of the steeply inclined side of the building. Marvin followed him, and together they began to crawl slowly and painfully down the 15 floors that separated them from the ground. As he crawled, the dank air and dust choked his lungs, his eyes smarted, and the terrifying distance down made his head spin. The occasional remarks from Marvin of the order of, "This is the sort of thing you life forms enjoy, is it? I ask merely for information," did little to improve his state of mind. About halfway down the side of the shattered building, they stopped to rest. It seemed to Zaphod, as he lay there panting with fear and exhaustion, that Marvin seemed a mite more cheerful than usual. Eventually he realized this wasn't so. The robot just seemed cheerful in comparison with his own mood. A large, scraggy black bird came flapping through the slowly setting clouds of dust and stretching down its scrawny legs, landed on an inclined window ledge a couple of yards from Zaphod. It folded its ungainly wings and teetered awkwardly on its perch. Its wingspan must have been something like 6 feet, and its head and neck seemed curiously large for a bird. Its face was flat, the beak underdeveloped, and halfway along the underside of its wing, the vestiges of something hand-like could be clearly seen. In fact, it looked almost human. It turned its heavy eyes on Zaphod and clicked its beak in a desultory fashion. "Go away," said Zaphod. "Okay," muttered the bird morosely and flapped off into the dust again. Zaphod watched its departure in bewilderment. "Did that bird just talk to me?" he asked Marvin nervously. He was quite prepared to believe the alternative explanation, that he was in fact hallucinating. "Yes," confirmed Marvin. "Poor soul," said a deep, ethereal voice in Zaphod's ear. Twisting round finally to find the source of the voice nearly caused Zaphod to fall off the building. He grabbed savagely at the protruding window fitting and caught his hands on it. He hung on, breathing heavily. The voice had no visible source whatever. There was no one there. Nevertheless, it spoke again. "A tragic history behind them, you know. A terrible blight." Zaphod looked wildly about. The voice was deep and quiet. In other circumstances, it would even be described as soothing. There is, however, nothing soothing about being addressed by a disembodied voice out of nowhere, particularly if you are, like Zaphod Beeblebox, not at your best and hanging from a ledge 8 stories up a crashed building. "Hey, he stammered. "Shall I tell you a story?" inquired the voice quietly. "Hey, who are you?" panted Zaphod. "Where are you?" "Later then perhaps," murmured the voice. "I am Gargravarr. I am the custodian of the Total Perspective Vortex. Why can't I see—" "You will find your progress down the building greatly facilitated," the voice lifted. "If you move about 2 yards to your left. Why don't you try it?" Zaphod looked and saw a series of short horizontal grooves leading all the way down the side of the building. Gratefully he shifted himself across to them. "Why don't I see you again at the bottom?" said a voice in his ear, and as it spoke, it faded. "Hey!" called out Zaphod. "Where are you?" "It will only take a couple of minutes," said the voice very faintly. "Marvin," said Zaphod earnestly to the robot, squatting dejectedly next to him. Did a voice just—" "Yes," Marvin replied tersely. Zaphod nodded. He took out his pearl-sensitive sunglasses again. They were completely black, and by now quite badly scratched by the unexpected metal object in his pocket. He put them on. He would find his way down the building more comfortably if he didn't actually have to look at what he was doing. Minutes later, he clambered over the ripped and mangled foundations of the building, and once more removing his sunglasses, he dropped to the ground. Marvin jumped in a moment or so later and lay face down in the dust and rubble, from which position he seemed too disinclined to move. "Ah, there you are," said the voice suddenly in Zaphod's ear. "Excuse me leaving you like that. It's just that I have a terrible head for heights. At least," it added wistfully, "I did have a terrible head for heights." Zaphod looked around slowly and carefully, just to see if he had missed something which might be the source of the voice. All he saw, however, was the dust, the wobble, and the towering hulks of the encircling buildings. "Hey, why can't I see you?" he said. "Why aren't you here?" "I am here," said the voice slowly. "My body wanted to come, but it's a bit busy at the moment. Things to do, people to see." After what seemed like sort of an ethereal sigh, it added, "You know how it is with bodies." Zaphod wasn't sure about this. "I thought I did," he said. "I only hope it's gone for a rest cure," continued the voice. "The way it's been living recently, it must be on his lost elbows." "Elbows?" said Zaphod. "Don't you mean lost legs?" The voice said nothing for a while. Zaphod looked around uneasily. He didn't know if it was gone, or was still there, or what it was doing. Then the voice spoke again. "So, you are to be put into the vortex, yes?" Well," said Zaphod with a very poor attempt at nonchalance. "This cat is in no hurry, you know. I can just slouch about and take in a look at the local scenery, you know." "Have you seen the local scenery?" asked the voice of Gargravarr. No." Zaphod clambered over the rubble and rounded the corner of one of the wrecked buildings that was obscuring his view. He looked out the landscape of Rockstar World B. Ah, okay, he said. I'll just sort of slouch about then. No, said Gargravarr. The vortex is ready for you now. You must come, follow me. Yeah, said Zaphod. And how am I meant to do that? I'll hum for you, said Gargravarr. Follow the humming. A soft keening sound drifted through the air, a pale, sad sound that seemed to be without any kind of focus. It was only by listening very carefully that Zaphod was able to detect the direction from which it was coming. Slowly, dazedly, he stumbled off in its wake. What else was there to do? The universe, as has been observed before, is an unsettlingly big place, a fact which for the sake of a quiet life most people tend to ignore. Many would happily move to somewhere rather smaller of their own devising, and this is what most beings in fact do. For instance, in one corner of the eastern galactic arm lies the large forest planet Oglarun, the entire intelligent population of which live permanently in one very small and crowded nut tree. In which tree they are born, live, fall in love, carve tiny speculative articles in the bark on the meaning of life, the futility of death and the importance of birth control, fight a few extremely minor wars, and eventually die strapped to the underside of some of the less accessible outer branches. In fact, the only Oglarunians who ever leave that tree are those who are hurled out of it for the heinous crime of wondering whether any of the other trees might be capable of supporting life at all, or indeed whether the other trees are anything other than illusions brought on by eating too many oglar nuts. Exotic though this behavior may seem, there is no life form in the galaxy which is not in some way guilty of the same thing, which is why the Total Perspective Vortex is as horrific as it is. For when you are put into the vortex, you are given just one momentary glimpse of the entire, unmentionable infinity of creation, and somewhere in it a tiny little marker, a microscopic dot on a microscopic dot, which says, "You are here." The grey plain stretched before Zaphod, a ruined, shattered plain. The wind whipped wildly over it. Visible in the middle was the steel pimple of the dome. This, gathered Zaphod, was where he was going. This was the Total Perspective Vortex. As he stood and gazed bleakly at it, a sudden inhuman wail of terror emanated from it, as of a man having his soul burned from his body. It screamed above the wind and died away. Zaphod started with fear and his blood seemed to turn to liquid helium. "Hey, what was that?" he muttered voicelessly. "A recording," said Gargravarr, "of the last man who was put in the vortex. It is always placed to the next victim, a sort of prelude." "Hey, it sounds really bad," stammered Zaphod. "Couldn't we maybe slope off to a party or something for a while? Think it over?" "For all I know," said Gargravar's ethereal voice, "I'm probably at one. My body, that is. It goes to a lot of parties without me. Says I only get in the way. Hey ho." "What is all this with your body?" said Zaphod, anxious to delay whatever it was that was going to happen to him. "Well, it's busy, you know," said Gargravarr hesitantly. "You mean it's got a mind of its own?" said Zaphod. There was a long and slightly chilly pause before Gargravarr spoke again. "I have to say," he replied eventually, "that I find that remark in rather poor taste." Zaphod muttered a bewildered and embarrassed apology. "No matter," said Gargravarr, "you weren't to know." The voice fluttered unhappily. "The truth is," it continued in tones which suggested he was trying very hard to keep it under control, "the truth is that we are currently undergoing a period of legal trial separation. I suspect it will end in divorce." The voice was still again, leaving Zaphod with no idea of what to say. He mumbled uncertainly. "I think we are probably not very well suited," said Gargravarr again at length. "We never seem to be happy doing the same things. We always had the greatest arguments over sex and fishing. Eventually we tried to combine the two, but that only led to disaster, as you can probably imagine. And now my body refuses to let me in. It won't even see me." He paused again, tragically. The wind whipped across the plain. "It says I only inhibit it. I pointed out that in fact I was meant to inhibit it, and it said that was exactly the sort of smart aleck remark that got right up a body's left nostril, and so we left it. It will probably get custody of my forename." "Oh," said Zaphod faintly, "and what's that?" "Pisspot," said the voice. "My name is Pisspot Gargravarr." "Says it really all, does it?" Said Zaphod sympathetically. "And that is why I, as a disembodied mind, have this job. Custodian of the Total Perspective Vortex. No one will ever walk on the ground of this planet. Except the victims of the vortex. They don't really count, I'm afraid. Ah. I'll tell you the story. Would you like to hear it? Many years ago, this was a thriving, happy planet. People, cities, shops, a normal world. Except that on the high streets of these cities, there were slightly more shoe shops than one might have thought necessary. And slowly, insidiously, the number of these shoe shops were increasing. It's a well-known economic phenomenon, but tragic to see it in operation, for the more shoe shops there were, the more shoes they had to make and the worse and more unwearable they became. And the worse they were to wear, the more people had to buy to keep themselves shut, and the more the shops proliferated, until the whole economy of the place passed what I believe is termed the shoe event horizon, and it became no longer economically possible to build anything other than shoe shops. Result? Collapse, ruin and famine. Most of the population died out. Those few who had the right kind of genetic instability mutated into birds. You've seen one of them, who cursed their feet, cursed the ground and vowed that none should walk in it again. Unhappy lot. Come, I must take you to the vortex. Zaphod shook his head in bemusement and stumbled forward across the plain. And you, he said, you come from this hellhole pit, do you? No, said Gargravarr, taken aback. I come from the Foxstar World Sea. Beautiful place, wonderful fishing. I flit back there in the evenings, though all I can do now is watch. The Total Perspective Vortex is the only thing on this planet with any function. It was built here because no one else wanted it on the doorstep. At that moment, another dismal scream rent the air and Zaphod shuddered. What can do that to a guy? He breathed. The universe, said Gargravarr simply. The whole infinite universe. The infinite suns, the infinite distance between them, and yourself an invisible dot on an invisible dot, infinitely small. Hey, I'm Zaphod Beebrooks, man, you know, muttered Zaphod, trying to flap the last remnants of his ego. Gargravarr made no reply, but merely resumed his mournful humming till they reached the tarnished steel dome in the middle of the plain. As they reached it, a door hummed open in the side, revealing a small darkened chamber within. Enter, said Gargravarr. Zaphod started with fear. Hey, what, now? He said. Now. Zaphod peered nervously inside. The chamber was very small. It was steel-lined and there was hardly space in it for more than one man. It doesn't look like any kind of vortex to me, said Zaphod. It isn't, said Gargravarr. It's just the elevator. Enter. With infinite trepidation, Zaphod stepped into it. He was aware of Gargravarr being in the elevator with him, though the disembodied man was not for the moment speaking. The elevator began its descent. I must get myself into the right frame of mind for this, muttered Zaphod. There is no right frame of mind, said Gargravarr sternly. You really know how to make a guy feel inadequate. I don't. The vortex does. At the bottom of the shaft, the rear of the elevator opened up and Zaphod stumbled out into a smallish, functional, steel-lined chamber. At the far side of it stood a single upright steel box, just large enough for a man to stand in. It was that simple. It connected to a small pile of components and instruments via a single thick wire. Is that it? Said Zaphod in surprise. That is it. Didn't look too bad, thought Zaphod. And I get in there, do I? Said Zaphod. You get in there, said Gargravarr. And I'm afraid you must do it now. Okay, said Zaphod. He opened the door of the box and stepped in. Inside the box, he waited. After 5 seconds there was a click, and the entire universe was there in the box with him.
I hope you'll join us at the restaurant at the end of the universe when the next chapter drops very soon.